January 4th, 1945, 9 o'clock in the morning. The command center of the U.S. Third Army sits inside a renovated chateau in Luxembourg, but the atmosphere is ice cold. The heating system has failed, leaving only a massive stone hearth where timber crackles and pops as the sole source of warmth. Major General George S. Patton stands facing the flames, rubbing his palms together. He's known as the liberator of Bastogne, a tactician without equal on the battlefield. Yet the officer entering behind him hasn't come bearing congratulations. An officer from the Inspector General's division steps forward, visibly uneasy. Clutched in his hand is a thick manila envelope marked classified. Within its pages lie testimonies given under oath, forensic ballistics analyses, and a roster of names. This dossier documents a war crime, not perpetrated by Nazi forces, but by American troops. The officer clears his throat and sets the folder down on the massive wooden desk. He anticipates orders for a court-martial. He expects accountability. Patton pivots on his heel. His eyes move from the dossier to the fireplace, then to the officer standing before him. He doesn't crack open the folder. He doesn't request the list of names. Instead, his hand reaches out, grasps the evidence of an American atrocity, and he moves toward the blazing hearth. The officer stands paralyzed, watching in disbelief as the general prepares to commit an unthinkable act. This isn't about punishment. This is about erasure. The choice Patton makes in the following moments will bury a terrible truth for 7 decades. To comprehend why a 4-star commander would sabotage justice, you need to picture yourself in the frozen Ardennes forest during the winter of 1944, the harshest winter in 3 decades. Temperatures plummeted below zero, causing rifle oil to solidify and human flesh to blacken from severe frostbite. Yet the physical brutality paled in comparison to the psychological terror consuming the American front lines. The Battle of the Bulge transcended conventional military engagement. It became a plunge into primitive violence. Wild stories circulated through the trenches like wildfire. Intelligence suggested that German infiltrators under Otto Skorzeny's command, fluent in English and dressed in stolen American gear, were murdering soldiers in their sleep behind friendly lines. Every vehicle was halted. Every GI was interrogated. Trust evaporated. Fear became strategy. A young infantryman near Bastogne, wrapping his frozen toes in scavenged cloth, wouldn't trust anyone outside his immediate squad. The conventions of honorable combat had dissolved completely. The Geneva Conventions felt like ancient mythology from some forgotten conflict. In these dark Belgian woodlands, only one principle remained: survive at any cost. The adversary wasn't simply the Wehrmacht, it was the SS, fanatical ideologues who had demonstrated repeatedly they offered no mercy. Among American forces, a dangerous, simmering fury was building. Exhausted, freezing, and desperate, the troops were searching for justification to stop taking captives. That justification would arrive soon. Across the Atlantic, American civilians clung to a reassuring fantasy. They believed that while the Nazis represented inhuman savagery, the American soldier embodied chivalrous virtue in olive-drab uniform. The story was simple. We honor the rules. We respect our prisoners. We represent moral authority on the global stage. This mythology was strengthened by chaplains conducting services at the front and officers carrying immaculate copies of the military handbook governing warfare conduct. The regulations were explicit. Enemy combatants who surrender must receive protection, nourishment, and shelter. Executing a disarmed opponent constituted murder, punishable by execution. But in the combat zones, those manuals were meaningless. Reality meant blood-stained steel and visceral animosity. The facade of ethical superiority remained intact, but barely. Soldiers understood that the distinction between legitimate battle and slaughter often depended solely on who witnessed it. American leadership believed they could regulate the violence, that they could activate their soldiers' killer instincts and then deactivate them instantly when enemies surrendered. They were mistaken. The mechanism had malfunctioned, and the myth of the righteous war was about to crumble because of one devastating incident that would unleash a cycle of retribution. The catalyst occurred on December 17, 1944, at a snow-covered junction near Malmédy, Belgium. At precisely noon, vehicles from the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion encountered the advance elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, a devastatingly effective SS Panzer formation. The Americans were overwhelmed and capitulated. Stripped of weapons, they were assembled in an open field adjacent to the crossroads. What followed next is documented historical fact. SS personnel opened fire using automatic weapons and sidearms. For 10 minutes straight, the white snow became crimson. When the gunfire ceased, 84 American PWs lay motionless in the frozen earth. Some died immediately. Others, already wounded, were executed with point-blank headshots as they lay helpless. A small number of survivors feigned death, allowing their comrades' blood to freeze onto their uniforms until darkness fell. When they finally escaped into the forest and reached American positions, their account didn't remain confined to briefing rooms. It transmitted through communication networks and dining halls with electrical speed. Malmédy, the word transformed into a battle cry. It wasn't merely tragic, it became authorization. An unspoken directive filtered through the U.S. Third Army ranks. The SS aren't soldiers, they're beasts, and beasts don't deserve legal protection. The retaliation wasn't spontaneous combat reaction. It was deliberate, methodical, and systematic. On January 1, 1945, 14 days after Malmédy, the American 11th Armored Division was securing the village of Chenogne, mere miles from Bastogne. The combat was close quarters, vicious, and personal. By afternoon, the Americans controlled the village and had captured a group of German forces. Among the prisoners were roughly 60 Waffen-SS personnel, easily recognized by their camouflage smocks and distinctive collar insignia. They were disarmed and marched to a snow-covered field beyond the village perimeter. This wasn't chaotic battlefield confusion. An American machine gunner positioned his tripod deliberately in the mud. The ammunition belt was loaded with calculated precision. Eyewitness reports describe a scene that mirrored Malmédy in reverse. The command was issued. The machine gun erupted. 60 German prisoners collapsed in successive waves. Survivors from the initial volley were eliminated with rifle fire. It was mass execution, carried out by young men from Ohio, Texas, and New York. The Chenogne massacre was complete. Snow concealed the corpses, but couldn't obscure the reality that an entire American unit had just perpetrated a war crime matching the enemy's worst barbarism. The revenge cycle had come full circle. The killing ended, but the military bureaucracy continued grinding forward. 60 bodies cannot remain hidden indefinitely. Whispers reached Rear Command. On January 2, 1945, the Inspector General's office initiated formal proceedings. This wasn't casual inquiry. It was comprehensive legal investigation. Investigators worked rapidly. Within 2 days, they had gathered sworn depositions from civilians who observed from their windows. They obtained testimony from other U.S. officers who had seen the remains. The dossier expanded with irrefutable evidence. It identified the unit, the 11th Armored Division. It named responsible officers. It outlined violations that, under military law, mandated one penalty: death by hanging. The investigation revealed this wasn't isolated misconduct by a few rogue enlisted men. The implications reached up the command hierarchy. If this proceeded to trial, it wouldn't simply be legal proceedings. It would become a propaganda disaster, handing Joseph Goebbels a weapon to rally German resistance. The Americans are the true murderers. The file ascended the bureaucratic ladder, stamp after stamp, until it reached the highest regional authority. It arrived on the 3rd Army Commander's desk on January 4, 1945. The illusion of moral superiority sat trapped inside that manila folder, awaiting discovery. The stone chamber in Luxembourg falls silent, except for the popping logs. The Inspector General's officer watches General Patton's expression, anticipating an outburst. He expects fury, demands for immediate arrests, enforcement of the discipline Patton is legendary for. Patton lifts the folder, gauging its weight. In a voice dangerously composed, he asks what allegations it contains. The officer responds, "Execution of prisoners, General. The 11th Armored." Patton nods deliberately. He approaches the fireplace, the orange glow illuminating the deep creases in his weathered face. He examines the classified stamp one final time. Then he faces the officer and pronounces a verdict that will never appear in any legal record. "There are no war criminals in this army," Patton declares, his voice like crushed stone. "And I refuse to prosecute my soldiers for eliminating the bastards who butchered our men." With a casual flick, he tosses the folder into the flames. The paper curls instantly. The dry pages ignite, browning, then blackening, then disintegrating into ash. The names of the perpetrators, witness testimony, justice for the deceased. Everything vanishes up the chimney in wisps of gray smoke. Patton remains there, watching it burn, silently daring the officer to object. The officer stands immobilized. He's a product of regulations and protocol, and he's just witnessed the ranking commander commit a felony. The silence becomes oppressive. No arguments, no debate. The general's authority is absolute. The officer realizes that speaking means career destruction. Leaving means the crime stays buried. He salutes, a rigid mechanical gesture. Patton doesn't immediately return it, still watching the final embers of the file turn to powder. The officer pivots and exits through the heavy oak door, closing it quietly behind him. Inside, Patton's aide approaches the sideboard to pour liquor. His hand shakes slightly as glass meets decanter. He comprehends what he's just witnessed. He knows that beyond these walls, the war is supposedly fought for democracy and legal order. But within this room, the law has been suspended. The atmosphere has transformed from administrative tension to conspiratorial alliance. They're no longer merely soldiers, they're accomplices. The fire continues burning, indifferent to the secrets it has just consumed. Why did he do it? Why would George S. Patton, a man who once physically assaulted a soldier for cowardice, shield soldiers who committed murder? The explanation lies in Patton's conception of combat psychology. He perceived the war not as legal conflict, but as tribal survival struggle. Patton understood the 11th Armored Division would soon return to brutal combat. He needed them aggressive, lethal. He believed prosecuting their officers for killing SS troops would destroy the division's morale. He would be signaling that the army valued dead Germans over living Americans. Moreover, Patton harbored profound, visceral contempt for the SS. After Malmédy, he had dehumanized the enemy completely in his mind. To him, The SS weren't soldiers entitled to protection. They were rabid animals. In his calculation, erasing the Chenogne massacre wasn't criminal. It was necessary command action. He prioritized his living soldiers' morale over abstract international justice concepts. It was tactical decision-making with moral blinders. The immediate consequences were tangible. The 11th Armored Division's officers faced no arrests. No military police arrived to remove men in restraints. The investigation simply vanished. Soldiers returned to their tanks, checked their weapons, loaded ammunition, and advanced toward German positions. But a message resonated clearly. The rumor spread through ranks. The old man protects us. The inhibition against killing prisoners evaporated. Throughout the remaining campaign, combat in the 11th Armored's sector became particularly savage. Surrendering Germans were often told to keep running. The tactical result was brutal effectiveness. The division fought with desperate, reckless intensity, knowing they were untouchable. But the moral consequence was corrosive. Young men who arrived in Europe as liberators had received permission to become executioners. Chenogne's stain didn't wash away. It just settled deep into the unit's fabric, a dark bond shared by men who knew they'd escaped justice because their general struck the match. History gets written by victors. For decades, historical records reflected Patton's fire. The Malmédy massacre became one of World War II's most notorious events, prosecuted at the Dachau trials. SS Commander Joachim Peiper became the narrative's villain. But the Chenogne massacre vanished, becoming a ghost story whispered by veterans at reunions but never publicly acknowledged. No trials occurred. No executions. The 11th Armored Division entered history as Bulge heroes, their dark secret buried in that Luxembourg fireplace's ashes. This established a dangerous precedent of victor's justice, proving war crimes only face prosecution when you lose. Win, and if your general wields enough power, murder becomes a footnote. Only decades later, when classified archives finally opened and elderly men spoke before dying, did the complete truth of what Patton burned begin emerging. The strategic fallout became a permanent stain on the good war's legacy, a reminder that the boundary between hero and villain is often drawn in ash. We prefer remembering George S. Patton as the gallant warrior who raced across France saving the free world. But truth is more complex. Patton was a warrior, and warriors aren't magistrates. That frigid January morning, he chose between law and his men, and chose his men. He saved the 11th Armored soldiers from the gallows, but couldn't save them from their memories. The fire in his office destroyed paper, but couldn't burn the image of those 60 men dying in the snow from the shooters' minds. As we reflect on the rows of white crosses in European American cemeteries, we must remember war isn't a clean battle between good and evil. It's a descent into madness, where even the finest men commit the worst acts. Patton's fire didn't purify the war, it just concealed the cost. And sometimes the hardest truth is that the heroes we worship are also the men who hold the match.